Throughout history, many civilizations have been wiped out by deadly diseases. Entire cities would be decimated with absolutely nothing to stop the spread of the sickness. The sick would turn to ancient medicine, but it wasn't always effective. Sometimes they were prescribed mercury or arsenic, other times animal testicles, and sometimes the cure was worse than the disease itself. But the people of the past still had some tricks up their sleeves. They developed ingenious ways to prevent, control, and even cure diseases without modern medicine. Let's start with the most famous pandemic in history, the plague. This horrible disease swept through Europe from 1346 to 1353. It is estimated that half of Europe's population was wiped out by the plague. That's around 25 million people. There are three main theories for how the disease started. First, the bacteria was brought to Europe by rats traveling on ships from Asia. Second, fleas that lived on these rats carried the disease. And third, the bacteria could have come from human-to-human contact. Whatever the case, this horrible pandemic lasted for 7 years and killed millions. But the people of the time didn't sit around and wait for a cure. They took matters into their own hands, or should I say feet. Doctors at the time wore long protective clothing and covered their faces with a mask. These masks had a beak like a bird's and were filled with fragrant substances like flowers, herbs, and spices. The idea was that the smell would purify the air around them and prevent them from getting sick. It sounds crazy, but it may have worked, or at least it gave them a false sense of security. Either way, the plague didn't just go away. It took 7 years for it to run its course. By the end of it, around 30 to 50% of Europe's population was dead. And while we can't say for sure if the masks helped, we can say that they didn't hurt, so maybe that's something to be thankful for. But not everyone was so lucky. In 1855, a cholera pandemic broke out in India. At the time, there were no vaccines or antibiotics, so the only way to treat cholera was to replace the fluids the patient lost when they had diarrhea or vomiting. Unfortunately, most of the people who got sick were too poor to get treatment. The ones who did seek help were often given opium to make them constipated, so they wouldn't lose any more fluids. Of course, this wasn't really a cure, and many people died because of this terrible treatment. But some diseases were a little easier to deal with. Smallpox was one of the most common illnesses throughout history. Symptoms included a high fever, weakness, and a rash that would eventually turn into severe blisters. The blisters would then turn into pustules, which would eventually fall off, leaving behind red, raw skin. If the pustules became infected, the person could die. The sick person would cover themselves with a paste made of either vinegar or milk to try and reduce the pain. Then they would apply a cloth soaked in cold water to lower their fever. Even though these methods weren't always successful, they were better than doing nothing. Vaccines for smallpox weren't invented until the late 1700s, but before that, the best way to avoid getting sick was to avoid contact with someone who was already sick. People would cover their faces with masks, while others would cover their mouths while talking. Some people even wore gloves to avoid touching contaminated surfaces. Even though some of these methods seem silly today, they all serve the same purpose, to prevent the spread of disease. And some people took things even further. Emperor Nero, who ruled Rome from 54 to 68 AD, believed that the best way to prevent disease was to avoid people. He stopped attending parties and gatherings and spent most of his time alone. He also built a network of tunnels and ventilation shafts under the floor of his palace. He thought that this would keep him safe from disease and allow him to breathe in fresh air. Whether or not he was actually safer because of these tunnels is unknown, but it's clear that he was very concerned about the spread of disease. These are just a few examples of how ancient civilizations fought back against deadly diseases. While many of their methods may seem strange to us today, they were often very effective. Maybe we can learn from their example the next time a pandemic hits. How do you think these ancient methods compare to what we do today? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.